Hello again everybody, hope you're all doing well. So in this video I'm going to be talking about air filters and mostly I'm just going to be talking about the stock filters versus pod filters. Now for the purpose of this video I'm going to use the example of a 50cc two-stroke that's been, it's got a big bore kit on it, so it's now 70cc and it's basically in the process of getting a street tune, as I like to call it, which is that it's not going full out as much power as it can possibly produce. We're sort of aiming for a happy medium between more power than the original 50, but still a degree of reliability, or as much as possible anyway. So on to the air filters then. What are the advantages and disadvantages of each? So I have here a stock air filter. Now the stock filters, believe it or not, are actually not as bad as you might think, and most of the time they're not as restrictive as you might think. If we take my example of the 50cc, and bear in mind that yes, I'm talking about a 52 stroke, but when it comes to air filters and what I'm talking about, you can generally apply it to most things. Especially on smaller engines though, the stock air filter is probably one of the best things you can have. So, as I say, it's not as restrictive as you might think. The stock air filter can, up to a certain point, actually deal with modifications to the rest of the bike. So let's take my 70cc big bore two-stroke, for example. It's a street tune, so, you know, it is possible to push two strokes to quite high power. A 70cc, you could probably get it up to the sort of mid-20 horsepower if you push it to its absolute limit. And I mean that absolute limit where you're rebuilding the engine pretty much after every couple of hours. Point is, it is possible, and for that you would need a freer flowing filter, but for a standard street tune, which is what I'm going for, you're looking around about 10 horsepower. Now the standard air filter will actually be fine for that. It's only once you start going beyond that that you need a bit more flow. So sometimes, and I'll show you the inside of this in a minute, sometimes there's a small bit inside which can be a little bit restrictive, but that can always be removed. But why would you want to stick with your stock filter when you could get one of those sexy looking pod filters? Well, the pod filters, as great as they are, they have a number of problems. Problem number one, yes, they do flow more air. In fact, they flow the maximum amount of air because there is very little restriction to them. But generally that also means that they're not that great at filtering either. Some of the pod filters I've seen, the amount of dirt they actually let through, I mean, sure, they'll filter out the larger rocks, but they still let through quite a lot of dirt into the carburetor, so that's not great. The second problem is that because they're open, obviously if you're riding along and the weather changes, for example, like maybe it's a nice sunny day, maybe it starts raining a little bit, the road gets a bit wet, all that crap from the road and moisture get up onto the air filter element and can either, one, block it, or two, moisture can just get through into the carburetor. Again, not great. The third thing about them being open is that they are much more sensitive to changes in the climate. So especially if you've got a carbureted bike. Now, fuel injected bikes, a little bit different. They are capable of reading the air fuel mixture and adjusting slightly for changes in temperature and air quality and stuff like that. Carbureted bikes, once you've set the jetting in the carburetor, they are stuck with that jetting, and so any changes in the weather and stuff like that are going to affect them. Now an open air filter is really sensitive to those changes, and so you'll find that you can jet your bike to be perfect on one day and then the next day it won't be perfect at all and might even be running quite horribly. And as I say, you'll find it only runs well under certain weather conditions. The advantages of a standard air filter or air box is that effectively what you've got in here is a little microclimate, because it sucks air in, and I'll open this one up. I mean, you can see obviously it's a sealed unit apart from the intake and the outlet. But if I open this up, so let's have a look at this. You can see that the air doesn't go directly through the filter. What it does is it comes in, goes down, fills up this box, and then goes through here. And so because it spends a little bit of time in that box, it kind of settles down a little bit, if that makes sense. Think of it a bit like it's a really cold day outside, and every time there's a gust of wind, you get a real cold freeze. But if you stand inside a shed, that shed might not have heating and it will still be cold, but every time there's a breeze, it doesn't suddenly dramatically lower the temperature. The temperature inside that shed remains relatively constant. And that's effectively what happens here. The temperature inside here remains relatively constant. And in fact, depending on where your air filter is positioned, if it's over the exhaust like on some bikes, or actually, to be fair, even if it's over the transmission, there is a certain amount of heat being generated underneath it, which is coming up and helping to keep that a tiny bit warmer. Now, yes, there is the whole thing about cold air intake and stuff like that, but when we're talking about scooters and motorcycles here, so that's kind of not something you want to worry about. And in fact, even if you had a pod filter, you've got the thing of, if it's hanging over the back, it's the same situation. It's either getting heat off of one thing or another, or basically it doesn't matter if you've got the pod filter or this. The temperature of the air intake on a motorcycle is much harder to control than it is on a car. Anyway, never mind that. So, advantage then of having this, as I say, is it's got its own little microclimate. It's a lot cleaner as well, so the standard filter is going to do a much better job of keeping all the crap out of your engine, which is what you want. It's also a lot easier to jet. So as I've mentioned probably several times already, because the pod filter is so much more sensitive to changes, it means that it's not going to run great all the time, and it also makes it harder to get the jetting right, because you might, I don't know, say you're trying to jet your carburetor, so you start with a jet that's too rich and you start working your way down, and maybe on day one you get it pretty close and it's starting to get late and you think, right, okay, well, I'm going to carry on tomorrow. Well, tomorrow the weather's just a little bit different and suddenly the jetting's way out and you find yourself thinking, oh, I don't know, maybe I've gone wrong somewhere, and you're basically back at square one. So it can really be a pain in the backside to try and jet a pod filter compared to a standard filter. So in what situations then, if, as I'm saying, the standard filter is basically easier to jet and generally performance-wise, as far as, you know, filtering performance and actual engine performance is probably the best thing to go for most street tunes, what situation then would you want to go for a pod filter, given the disadvantages that I've just said? Well, to be perfectly honest, racing, mostly. You'll find that the reason pod filters are so, what's the word? Oh, I can't even remember. Nope, it's gone out of my head. Never mind, popular, that's it. I'm learning Czech at the minute, so my brain's kind of frazzled. Anyway, pod filters are more popular. The reason for that is because everyone sees them on the racing bikes and scooters and they think, that means it must go faster. And to a degree, yes. I mean, if you've got the maximum airflow you can get, you can obviously stick a nice rich jet in there and you can get the maximum performance out of the engine, but it will perform at the higher RPMs better than the lower. So that's another advantage to this stock air filter that I forgot to mention. They do tend to perform better at lower to mid RPMs, where the pod filter can be quite flat at those RPMs, and then when it gets to the higher RPMs, then it will be absolutely fine. Obviously, if you jet the carburetor correctly, even with a pod filter, it will run nicely throughout the rev range, but ultimately, fully open filters are not designed to be very good at filtering road dirt, because they're not designed for the road, they're designed for the track. They're designed to be flat out the whole way around, and that's it. Where on a road bike, you're always better off with a filter. Now, let's say, for example, you've got a road-tuned bike, but you want to tune it to be like semi-race. So basically, you want it to be the fastest it can possibly be, but on the road. In that situation, I would recommend modifying the stock airbox. So you'll see here, obviously, we've got this intake that I explained. Now, the one on this is pretty open. There's no point in opening that up anymore. It's already as open as you'll want it to be. Sometimes, though, these parts can actually be quite small inside these airboxes. So there are some situations where you might want to take this off and just have that intake that way, because it's still gonna come in and then down and fill up that box area. So you're still gonna have the advantages of this system, but with a slightly more open opening. But as I say, with this one, you wouldn't bother because that's pretty big anyway. So that's something you can do. Some people like to drill holes directly in the side. Now, I don't recommend that because, as I say, you don't want the air to go directly through. You want the air to come into the box, circulate around a bit, and then go through. So rather than drilling holes straight in the side, I'd recommend just opening up the original intake area a little bit if you need to do that. But that's, like I say, if you've got a 50cc or a 70cc and you're trying to push beyond 10 horsepower, then that's something you might look into. But for most people, you would just stick with the original airbox and concentrate on tuning everything else to be the best it can possibly be. So that's pretty much everything, I think. Hopefully that made sense and you guys enjoyed this little video. If you did, please do give it a like. If you haven't already, go check out my other videos. And for now, I'll catch you again soon.